The former Downing Street Director of Communications, Lee Kane, and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Stacey Cooper. Great to have you both with us. Just to pick up on the final part there of Ben Wallace's interview, he said, look, the Prime Minister needs to be clear. He says we're going to have to cut this budget, which could be painful, which could be difficult, in order to reinvest more in defence. I mean, is he right, do you think?
Well, it's always the first instinct of a Conservative to try and cut public services, and we think that would be the wrong way to do it. We Liberal Democrats have said that there are other ways that you could raise money in a fairer way without having to cut public services. So, for example, you could raise taxes on the big tech companies, you could raise taxes on the big gaming companies, you could reform capital gains tax in a way that would be much fairer and would raise more money than the Labour Party has raised through its changes to capital gains tax. And those three measures alone would raise several £billion a year. That is a way in which you could raise the money from taxing big companies that have made billions of pounds in profits without having to cut into public services, which, quite frankly, is still on their knees.
Isn't that kind of what he's saying? He's saying, look, you know, we can't have this thing where, like, everyone's a winner, where there's no painful decisions. If you're going to raise that kind of money for defence, someone's going to lose. Who would be losing?
Well, if you reformed capital gains tax in the way that we would suggest, then the 0.01% richest people in the country would be losers because they would be paying more in capital gains tax. If you increased, the tech tax or the digital services tax, then the big tech companies would have to pay those taxes. If you put taxes on the big gaming companies, then the gaming companies themselves would pay it either out of their profits or they would pass that on to people who use their gaming products. So those would be the people who would be having to pay. I would much rather that those people pay rather than people who were stuck on an NHS waiting list.
Lee, what do you reckon?
I think that undoubtedly we probably do need to invest more in defence. Whether we can get to 3% is questionable. I think the idea that we can fund that through taxes on tech companies and further taxes on business when we've already had pretty punitive taxes on business over the last, within the last budget. Business is deeply unhappy and howling really already, and the economy's getting deeply squeezed. A lot of these big tech companies will find more inviting environments than the UK and go elsewhere. So I think it could have, difficult impact on our economy. And I think the choices fundamentally might be deeper. If we're going to get towards 3%. Where are they going to get the money from? I think there are some really, really hard choices for the government and for the Chancellor ahead on how you're going to fund that kind of defence spending, because it is a significant sum that we're talking about.
Should we talk a little bit about the geopolitics as well? Because, look, we've got this situation where you have Donald Trump talking to Vladimir Putin on the phone. The US and Russia are opening up talks about what happens to Ukraine. Where is the UK here? Do you think that Keir Starmer is showing leadership, or do you think he should be doing more, and what?
I mean, I have to say, I think it's absolutely outrageous what is happening. The fact that Ukraine is not at the table and front and centre of these negotiations, along with Europe and the UK, I think it really is outrageous that has happened. I think in terms of leadership, well, Keir Starmer has said that there may have to be boots on the ground. We Liberal Democrats have said that we would support that move. We think that is showing leadership. But what we've also said is that we think that Parliament needs to have a debate on these issues because things are moving very, very quickly. This is an era-defining moment in our, not just in our domestic politics, but in European politics and global politics as well. I think when Keir Starmer goes to Washington next week, we would like him to go with a really strong mandate so he can say that the whole of the British Parliament is behind him, and we want to get that debate and that vote as soon as possible.
I think that I agree that Zelensky should be part of any peace negotiations. I also think it's a good thing that we're moving close to a discussion on a peace process and what that may look like. We've had a generation of young people in the East who have, been absolutely decimated from a war. So I think any step towards peace is a positive thing. I think from a European point of view, I think there's a question of what is the outcome, the best realistic outcome that we want, and how do we achieve that? Do we want to continue as we are, which is huge cost to the economy, huge cost to lives in the East for, what we're seeing is slow but continual Russian gains? Do we look to put boots on the ground, the cost with that and the potential element for escalation with that and the damages that could do? Or do we look to find a peaceful solution? Now, that might be the best, worst outcome. None of them are particularly good, and I think it's a very difficult situation for the government to find themselves in to navigate out of that. And it seems that basically the Americans are cutting Europe out, and I think that's more of a broader, troubling issue of, if you're Keir Starmer, which way do you go? Do you go towards the Americans? We've got further economic issues, you've got tariffs, you've got all of these broader questions, or do you move towards Europe? and some of the consequences that could have. And I think these are going to be fundamental questions for the next 5 to 10 years.
Lots more from both of you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed. Right, let's chat to Lee and Daisy, shall we? Lots to unpick there. Lee, we've been talking an awful lot about peacekeeping forces. There you heard Tony Abbott say, look, Europe can't ride on Americans' coattails, and UK should do it alone if needed. What do you make of it?
I think it'd be quite courageous potentially to do it without some sort of American involvement. And I think, frankly, it's unrealistic. I don't think the government will split from the Americans. I think we're going to have an awful lot of hot air at the moment as the negotiations going on, a lot of red lines, both sides that, I think we should probably take a step back and see what the shape of a deal will look like. But I think we would want to remain part of NATO, part of whatever force that would then go into a negotiation. I think going independently could be
courageous.
Yes.
Is what you said.
Yes.
I feel like that was
in the yes minister
chosen.
sense, I think, yes.
What do you make of it?
Well, look, I think the first thing that we ought to be doing here in the UK is restoring our troop numbers. It's pretty unforgivable that under the Conservatives, our troop numbers were cut by 10,000 to the lowest level since the Napoleonic Wars. That has to that really does have to be the first step, and it wouldn't cost that much in the grand scheme of things. So I think getting that immediate commitment to rebuild our own troop numbers and reverse that 10,000 troop cuts is the priority. But as we've said before, we do think that it's right to call for boots on the ground, and we hope that the UK can show some leadership amongst other European countries to galvanise some energy in that direction.
Lee, you touched on it earlier when you were saying that, look, there's almost like a repositioning going on across the world, and the UK might have to be making some choices about whether we try and wed as closely as possible to the US or hug Europe a bit tighter. Where do you think we should be going?
I suspect we will inevitably move towards the Americans again. I think, the UK is generally its strongest when it's that bridge between Europe and America. There's a great role to be played there. And I think at the moment, Italy and Maloney seem to be taking that space with some of the Americans. But I think when you look at how intertwined we are with our nuclear deterrent, when you look at how intertwined we are with our economy and tariffs, I suspect there'll be a big push from particularly the deep state to move towards the Americans.
Well, I think if you were talking strictly in trade terms only, we certainly can see a world in which you would do some kind of closer deal with the EU, and we've called for a bespoke customs union between the UK and the EU that would enable British businesses to trade goods more freely and get rid of some of the red tape that was introduced through Brexit. But you could see a deal with the US potentially on services, as long as our NHS and our farmers were protected through that deal. But clearly what we're seeing is that this isn't just about trade, is it? And there's many things that are outside of our control. What's really important, though, is that when you think about President Trump, I think strength is the only language that he knows. And if we are going to look like a strong country, we have to have other options on the table to show that we can, if necessary, walk away. And that's why I think it's really important that we do start those negotiations with the EU about having a closer trading relationship, because we need to have different options on the table.
Yeah, always a good tactic in any negotiation, that, isn't it? I feel like you're desired by someone else is always a good one. Thanks both very much indeed. Have you got any embarrassing things you said about Donald Trump that you've been deleting from your ex profile, or?
I might have said something in the pub once or twice, but I don't think I put it on my Twitter account.
Very sensible.
My ex account.
Very sensible. It's interesting, isn't it, seeing someone like Sadiq Khan, because look, he has got these strongly held views about Donald Trump, and the US president's all about free speech, isn't he? But I guess it is a bit of a diplomatic dance you've got to play now.
Well, for sure. But I think the fact of the matter is that in politics, I've always tried to take the view that you should play the ball, not the man, right? And that's always what I try to do in my politics. And I think, we have to... character does matter in politics, right? The character of a person, the character of a leader does matter. And I think people increasingly are more interested in personality politics and the personality of leaders. And therefore, you can see why people criticise people's character and behaviour and things that they say and the way they behave. But ultimately, I think people fundamentally judge politicians on how they deliver and what they deliver. And I think, for all of the hype and for everything that everyone says, every politician, the UK, Donald Trump, everybody else, they'll be judged on what they do.
You must have, I guess, got a bit of a sense of Donald Trump during your time in Number 10.
I think I was on quite a few of the calls, some with Theresa May, some with Boris Johnson, with Donald Trump, and he's exactly the person you see on TV. There was no difference when it was off camera. So
I'd love to have heard that hour-and-a-half chat with Putin and Trump. I mean, can you imagine? Yeah.
They are. I mean, the calls were extraordinary. I think many, Foreign Office and Number 10 civil servants who've been around a long time would say they'd never quite heard diplomatic conversations like them. But Donald Trump has been elected by the people of America, and I think there's a broader point which, I agree with, where we talk about politicians and we talk about delivery. And there's a reason why across the West, people are moving away from traditional parties and institutions because they feel that they're not delivering them. They feel that their lives are worse than their parents and their grandparents, and they're looking for alternatives. And until we start to actually deliver for people, we're going to fall further and further into these trends of people moving away from the institutions that we've built.
I mean, do you think the Lib Dems have benefited from that as well, with, people moving to different parties, not just Labour and the Conservatives?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the result we got in the general election. It was our best ever election result ever for our party, and now we're the largest third party that's existed in Parliament for 100 years. So certainly we've benefited, and we did hear on the doorstep throughout the general election, time and again, people saying everything is broken and nothing works. And there was a real kind of sweet spot that people wanted, where they wanted to know that there was a political party that had ideas on how to fix things, but they weren't so outlandish. They didn't believe that you could actually do it. And I think we hit that sweet spot, and that's why we got such a good result.
I mean, there is wider questions as well, isn't there, about, it's not just politics. It's also, if you look at the media, we look at ourselves, we look at institutions, across the UK and across the world. I guess people are starting to question, whether these things are working. And it's absolutely right. Really interesting chat. Thank you both very much indeed. Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, has said today the Prime Minister should recall Parliament to debate his plans for Ukraine. Now, it's obviously a very serious point, but we couldn't help but notice that in an increasingly uncertain world, the Lib Dems demanding the return of MPs to the Green benches is nearly always something you can count on. So apparently under Ed Davey, the Lib Dems have called for Parliament to be recalled at least 10 times that we could find. What's going on, Daisy? Why do you hate holidays so much?
Look, I think it speaks to just the sheer number of crises we've had over the last few years. If you looked at some of those examples you had on the screen there, this is when we had people dying in the back of ambulances, during the winter crisis like no other. The virtual Parliament when there were problems during the pandemic. Lots of examples of where actually it's been really important for when Parliament could have been having a debate about really important issues.
Recalling Parliament to open the pubs for the Lionesses World Cup final?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that was a good one. And I tell you what, I am actually a signatory to the piece of legislation that's going to change the law so that we don't have to recall Parliament, so that we can go to the pub to celebrate Lionesses the next time they win.
There you go, I love it, I love it. Recalling Parliament, I mean, what is it? What do you reckon?
I think we'd have cross-party consensus for that particular vote, so I think
what,
we'd be
on
happily.
pubs, opening pubs?
Yeah, I think we'd, it's a vote winner from that.
Yeah, you can totally see how it would go down quite well. Do you think that, I'm interested to know your thoughts, Lee, on this whole thing about recalling Parliament. Does it make a difference if MPs do get to debate these things as soon as they happen, or actually is it something where it's about theatrics and performance more than anything else?
It can probably be both, I'd imagine. I think, but it depends on the scale of the issue. I think there are clearly serious issues where it's only right and proper that Parliament is recalled, that elected representatives do have the chance to debate them, and there are certain things that is necessary. Some of those potentially, you may be not, and maybe it's a good photo op, but I think there's a judgment on all these things.
Yeah,
how many times was it? Did it actually go into a?
I don't know how
Parliament?
many times he was successful.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. Maybe you can tell me that. Has it ever actually worked? Ed Davey calling for Parliament to be recalled? Or
I don't think it hasn't resulted, but it has put pressure on the government of the day to do certain things. So, for example, with that winter crisis, which was absolutely awful, it was the 1st January after Rishi Sunak had just become Prime Minister. Number 10 did scrabble around and pull together a sort of a one-day conference with health leaders.
Thanks both very much indeed. Great to have you both on the programme.